Hey, you remember what your first Dragon Ball game was? Depending on what age bracket you fall into, it might be Final Bout, Budokai, or hell, even the Super Butoden games if you were emulation savvy enough. But I think every fan generally remembers what their first Dragon Ball game was. As for me, the first one I played was Final Bout, but the first one I owned was a little game called Dragon Ball Z Legendary Super Warriors for the Game Boy Color. This one's a turn-based RPG with a bit of card-based combat thrown in, spanning the middle of the Saiyan saga all the way to the end of the Buu saga, with a good chunk of playable characters and one of the most fun New Game Plus modes I've ever experienced. It's a great game. 2002 was kind of a turning point for Dragon Ball video games in the US specifically, since the show's popularity over here meant that it was completely viable to start releasing games here instead of just in Japan and Europe. 2002 alone saw the release of no less than 4 Dragon Ball Z games stateside. The aforementioned Game Boy Color game, Legacy of Goku, and an adaptation of the collectible card game for the Game Boy Advance, and of course the first Budokai entry by Dimps for the PlayStation 2. It's quaint now, but Budokai was kind of a big deal when it originally dropped. Having a Dragon Ball fighting game and it actually not being dog water kind of felt like a dream, and dropping right as the Buu Saga's Toonami airing started picking up steam caused the perfect storm. Though I played a lot of home consoles as a kid, portables were what I spent the majority of my time with growing up. They were cheaper, you could play them anywhere, and much to my parents' joy, they didn't hog the family television. When Budokai came out, I used to daydream about Game Boy Advance getting a Dragon Ball fighting game of its own. I was already a fighting game fan and a Dragon Ball fan on top of that, so I guess it was only natural for me. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait too long, as Dragon Ball games would start releasing at a pretty rapid clip from then onwards, a lot of which were fighting games, and quite a few of them were also handheld exclusive. This video aims to take a look at all of the exclusive Dragon Ball fighting games released for handheld platforms over the years. I'm looking strictly at games designed specifically for handhelds instead of conversions of existing games, so no Battle of Z Vita or Dragon Ball FighterZ Switch here. Though Dragon Ball didn't start getting handheld fighters until the early 2000s, they'd spanned several beloved Dragon Ball game series, ranging from Tenkaichi to even the Butoden games, on top of some attempts at new fighters as well. All that said, let's get started. Now, I'd certainly like to say that handheld Dragon Ball Z Fighter started off with a bang, but yeah, no, we've got to start off with a bit of a stinker here. Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu was released for the Game Boy Advance in late 2003 in the US and 2004 everywhere else, and this game is... oh boy. It was developed by Webfoot Technologies, who were more or less kinda holding down Dragon Ball games on the GBA at the time. They did the beat-em-up Dragon Ball GT transformation a bit later, and most famously were the devs behind the Legacy of Goku trilogy. Webfoot is actually still around today, though they exclusively make card games on PC. Huh. My first exposure to this game was actually through one of the old holiday catalog booklets Nintendo used to put out, showcasing their current hardware, their accessories, and upcoming games for their platforms. Taiketsu was featured in the GBA section of the book with its own page, and while the screenshot should have probably raised some alarm bells for me back then, I was so enamored by the possibility of a portable DBZ fighter that no red flags immediately registered for me at the time. I do want to point out one of the blurbs here though. It specifically highlights that one of the playable characters is Broly, whose debut movie had seen a Western release earlier that same year in the US. This was a pretty big marketing point for the game back then, to the extent that I'm pretty sure was the other reason I ended up getting the game. In fact, I distinctly recall the game's marketing touting Taiketsu as the first Dragon Ball Z game with Broly in it, which is really only true in America. Even back then, as someone who'd been introduced to the magic of emulation and Z-SNES around that same time, I knew Broly had been in at least one game before, Super Famicom's Super Butoden 2 as a secret character alongside Goku. Still though, being the dumbass middle schooler I was, I asked for the game for Christmas, got it, and was immediately hit with two realities. One, Broly isn't even playable at the start. In fact, he'll always be the very last character you unlock. And two, this game is ass. Where do I even start? I guess the visuals are as good a place as any. Taiketsu interestingly uses what seems like pre-rendered 3D sprites for its characters, which is definitely a novel choice for a game like this, but a lot of characters look so horribly off-model that it kinda wraps around to endearing. Android 18 in particular just has to be seen to be believed. Yeah, having a big-ass forehead has always been a part of her design, but goddamn. The characters animate about as good as they look too, which is to say, not well at all. Taiketsu is a 4-button fighter, not unlike an SNK game, with B and A being light punch and kick, while the shoulder buttons correspond to heavy punch and kick respectively. There's also a universal overhead chop command normal that everyone can do with forward and light punch. Thing is, every single character has the exact same animations for their normals, without exception. Shared animations across characters isn't inherently a bad thing. The Budokai games particularly were notorious for this, though from Budokai 3 onwards, they got a lot better about giving characters more unique animations. It's different when it's the exact same set of canned animations across the entire cast, and doubly so since the animations themselves are really stilted and don't really look right to begin with. Movement-wise, aside from the standard jump and moving forward and backward, you also have a forward dash and a back dash done by double tapping either horizontal direction, though it feels really sluggish. There is another optional component to fighting though, sky battles. By pressing down, down, up, and B, your character will fly off screen, and if the opponent follows by doing the same command, a sky battle gets initiated. Basically, whoever mashes the buttons the fastest wins and gets free damage in the knockdown. I imagine this was done to kinda get some portion of the lightning fast fight sequences Dragon Ball Z was known for implemented somehow. Hell, even the first few Budokai games had a similar mechanic. That said, there's no standard special moves for characters. They all share the same exact normals, and the only things really differentiating characters are their size and their super moves. For example, one of Nappa's super moves is a command grab. However, this command grab whiffs against characters like Gotenks and Krillin because they're too short to be grabbed by it. Meter in this game is pretty straightforward. There's 3 levels of meter, and each character has a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3 super. The supers themselves having pretty standard motion inputs, though a few of them do get a little weird. Supers are also the only time you'll see characters actually transform in this game. The Saiyans will go Super Saiyan for some of their supers, while characters like Frieza and Cell would transform into their final and perfect forms respectively, then de-transform back into their initial forms. Most of the supers are standard Dragon Ball fare, though there's some really funny ones. Broly has this one really slow dashing punch super that's no shit officially named Hovercraft Punch. Vegeta has this particularly hilarious level 3. Android 18 infamously has this one attack where it seems like she just shoots missiles out of her ass. It does actually vaguely remind me of a certain other fighting game cyborg that also happens to shoot missiles though. The funniest example to me though is Raditz. Raditz is one of those characters where he's had so little time in DBZ proper that the games usually just have to kinda make shit up for him in terms of moves, his key attacks being named after days of the week being the most prominent example. So in Taiketsu, he has this generic leaping elbow smash for one, and then this move called Fire Somersault, which Alright, time out. Hold on. Let me just boot this shit up real quick. Hold on. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. Hold on, let me cook for a sec. Oh my god. I see you, Webfoot. I know what you guys are. Looking at some old interviews with the developers for this game, they deliberately took inspiration from classic 2D fighting games for Taiketsu, specifically name-dropping Street Fighter Alpha and the King of Fighters. So you know what? Fair play. That's actually a pretty sick reference. That doesn't really save the game though. You start off with 7 characters: Goku, Gohan, Vegeta, Piccolo, Trunks, Android 18, and Krillin, and as you play through the game's tournament or time attack mode, you unlock an additional 8 characters: Raditz, Nappa, Gotenks, Android 16, Frieza, Cell, Boo, and Broly. Seems kinda shitty that Broly was basically this game's selling point, and yet he'll probably be the last major thing you unlock in the game anyway, and that's only if you're not sick of it by that point. Beating opponents in any of the single player modes nets you Z points, which can be spent in the game shop. There, you can buy character bios, music from the game, images from the gallery that are largely just low quality JPEGs of screen cap from the anime, and buy some cheat options. The cheat options range from having infinite super meter to turning them off entirely, and a mode where any contact with the opponent causes an explosion that knocks both of you down. I think the most interesting cheat here though is the one that enables an alternate version of Sky Battles. Turn this on, and instead of mashing buttons blindly to win, you actually have to quickly press buttons in the order displayed. It's tricky, but actually a bit more engaging than the default option. As an adult, I can understand that this game was likely done on a tight budget and with a strict development timeline, supported by it releasing a month before Christmas of 2004, so I can sympathize now with the dev team. As a kid back then though, I couldn't understand what went wrong. Apparently, this was also planned to link up to the GameCube in some way, but because there weren't any Dragon Ball games in the imminent future for GameCube that they could have feasibly had functionality with, they opted not to. Look, there's no real way around it, this game is ass. About the only positive memory I have of this game is playing against a friend with the infinite meter and the one-hit KO cheat turned on, and we basically made up this Goku-only meta where whoever got a Spirit Bomb or first wins. We'd actually do first to 20s on that shit because, again, middle schoolers are stupid. I will say, however, probably the one part of the game that actually kicks ass is the music. The intro theme for the game is reused from Legacy of Goku 2, and like that game, the vast majority of the soundtrack riffs over the Funimation dub score, owed to both games sharing a composer, Giannis Brown. As an admitted fan of the dub music, and before you purists come after me, I love the Kikuchi score as well, I do think it's pretty neat that you can pick out certain songs in the game and recognize them from certain moments in the dub. That said, this is probably the worst it gets on the Game Boy Advance for Dragon Ball, as nearly every other game on the platform ranges from playable to pretty damn good, including our next game. The following year would see the release of Dragon Ball Z Supersonic Warriors for the Game Boy Advance. This game's release is actually kinda deceptively important, not just for being the first good portable Dragon Ball fighter, but more so its developers. Supersonic Warriors was a jointly developed game, the first studio being Kavia. Kavia is not around anymore, but they worked on a ton of games, including the first Drakengard and Nier games, and a few Resident Evil games like Dead Aim and both Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles. The second developer is even more notable though, Arc System Works. Yeah, if you didn't already know, before Dragon Ball FighterZ, and even before Extreme Butoden, Arc's foray in the Dragon Ball fighting games began with this little game. Hell, the director of Supersonic Warriors, Junichi Motomura, actually went on to become the director of FighterZ 14 years later. A lot of the programmers and staff for the game went on to work on a bunch of future ArcSys fighters as well. The game's art director, Kazunori Taguchi, who'd already been a graphic designer in Guilty Gear X2, went on to become the art director for Sengoku Bizarre X and the lead designer of Battle Fantasia. Yukinori Goma, a background artist for Supersonic Warriors and its sequel, went on to become the lead 2D artist for Guilty Gear Xrd and its sequels, as well as working on Fighters and Guilty Gear Strive in a senior artist capacity. As for Supersonic Warriors itself, the game also kind of is its own unique beast that doesn't really play like any other Dragon Ball fighting game, or any fighting game in general really. Well, okay, there is actually one fighting game it shares some similarities with. Supersonic Warriors mostly takes place in the air, with the characters being able to freely air dash and fly around the stage, being able to carry momentum from said dashes into attacks. While characters can land and fight on the ground, you lose a lot of your movement and offensive options there, so pretty much all of your fighting will be in the air. With that in mind, there's more than a few surface level similarities conceptually with Taito's Psychic Force series, which also has a flying based combat system. Fighting in Supersonic Warriors is pretty straightforward. You have a light attack that can be done with the B button, and heavy attacks done with the A button. Holding either of these initiates a guard state. There's also a guard meter, and if you push the opponent's side of it to the very edge, they'll be in a lengthy guard break state where you can do pretty much whatever to them. If you hit them with a dash attack right before the meter recovers, you'll knock them into debris for some additional damage. You can fly around the stage with the D-pad, and double tapping in a direction will have you do a quick little air dash that travels a certain distance. You can do attacks under this air dash as well, and can even get a unique attack depending on your height and distance relative to your opponent's position on screen. For example, if Trunks dashes in from a certain distance and presses B, he'll do a cool little dashing sword slice maneuver. I think this is also one of the first Dragon Ball games to give Trunks normals with his sword outside of supers or ultimate attacks, which is pretty cool. Pressing B and A at the same time gives you a throw, and each character has a unique one. They range from Trunks' trademark Frieza killing maneuver, Krillin using Solar Flare, and my personal favorite, Boo temporarily turning the opponent to chocolate. The R button serves multiple purposes. You can use it to charge up your ki, displayed in the top left corner for the player, and different actions use this resource as well. By holding R and pressing B, you shoot a ki blast, and these can be rapid fired for as long as you have ki, with one exception I'll touch on later. Holding R and pressing A does a more powerful charged ki blast. These don't travel very far, but do a good amount of damage and even decent guard damage as well. Pressing R in a direction initiates a homing dash that can be steered somewhat. This also uses ki as well. The L button is reserved for special actions. Some characters have installs that can be toggled with that button, while certain characters have special techniques assigned to it under certain circumstances. For example, Goku's base form can initiate Kaioken with it, which powers him up at the cost of rapidly draining health, while Perfect Cell can utilize instant transmission with it using his fully powered up form. Holding R and pressing both A and B initiates supers, and things get pretty interesting here. The ki meter in this game can charge up to 100%. Supers in this game use either 50% or the full 100, but the super you do is determined by your position relative to the opponent. There's supers for being above, below, and positioned laterally to your opponent, and though this is universal for every character, the moves themselves change based on the character and which level version of them you're using. For example, when to the side of your opponent with Piccolo, you'll use the Special Beam Cannon. When above them, you'll use Light Grenade, and when below them, you'll do Hellzone Grenade. Some supers even have some additional effects. For example, if Frieza's Death Ball hits the stage floor instead of the opponent, a countdown timer will start. If it reaches 0, the stage blows up and Frieza automatically wins. The roster itself has the usual Dragon Ball mainstays with no real surprises, but how they're implemented is pretty interesting. Each character has 3 variations, or levels, with the final 2 being buyable in the game's shop menu. These variations change up a character's base damage output, as well as their supers, and sometimes even gives them new special traits as well as new sprites. For example, Gohan's first 2 forms represent him during the Cell games, while level 3 Gohan is based on the Buu saga, giving him new sprites, and even having him share some normals with Goku. Some characters also call in assists, and the assists they'll do will also depend on the level of the character as well. Level 1 Krillin will call in Namek Saga Gohan for a quick ki blast in one of his supers, while the level 2 version has Tien come in instead. I think the best example of character variety in general here is Gotenks though. Gotenks is unique in that even his level 1 form hits way harder than a lot of other characters, but that power comes with a price. Gotenks, unlike other characters, is on a strict time limit owed to the fusion dance that creates him. Once the countdown ends, he unfuses back into Goten and Trunks, counting as an instant loss. However, the higher level Gotenks is, the higher the fusion time limit, which is a neat little way to add in the fusion dance's little wrinkle while adhering to the game's set rules. There's a lot of neat character-specific mechanical touches like that in the game, and it's really cool. Android 18, for example, only gains ki by using physical attacks, since she can't charge it in this game on her own. The trade-off, however, is that she can infinitely rapidly fire off ki blasts without expending any ki whatsoever. Dr. Gero similarly can't conventionally gain ki at the speed other characters can, holding R with him only giving you literally 1% of ki every second or two. However, if he's hit with a ki blast in this state, he'll absorb it and it'll get added to his total ki. His throw also essentially functions as a ki steal as well. On top of a standard single-player ladder mode, Link Battle, and a surprisingly decent training and tutorial mode, this game also has story mode, which is divided into 2 types. First, you have the Saga stories, which basically reenact fight from the Frieza, Android/Cell, and Buu arcs to the best of their abilities with the game's playable roster. If you've played the Dragon Ball game with the story mode, this is certainly nothing new. More interestingly though, are the individual character stories, which are specifically built in-game as what-if stories that focus on scenarios where the character you choose becomes the main character. These range from relatively straightforward, like Goku and Trunks' stories, to villainous stories with bad endings for the universe, like Frieza and Cell's. The most interesting ones, however, are for the characters where you'd have to get pretty creative to have them believably saving the day. My personal favorite example of this overall is Piccolo's story. It starts off with Piccolo being the one to defeat Frieza on Namek. The Android saga mostly goes the same, Piccolo fusing with Kami and taking on Cell, though like in the original material, Cell becomes perfect anyway. During the preparations for the Cell games though, Piccolo laments reaching what he believes is his ceiling power-wise, and muses to himself that even fused with Kami, he's still feeling like there's a missing piece that could boost him even further. He ends up beating Cell thanks to Goku pulling the same thing he did with Raditz and more or less sacrificing himself to let Piccolo get the kill. In the Buu saga, Piccolo tries fighting Buu and predictably gets beaten. While again lamenting his lack of strength, he suddenly gets an idea. He has Barunga summoned on New Namek for a specific purpose. Remember when Piccolo said he felt like he was missing something? He realized what it was. He has Barunga resurrect Evil King Piccolo and demand that he fuses with him to reclaim all of his lowest power. Evil King Piccolo predictably refuses and only complies after Piccolo beats him in a pretty cool story-justified mirror match. Piccolo then takes on Boo again and wears him down a little, but still can't beat him. Piccolo figured this would be the case and whips out one last ace in the hole, the Evil Containment Wave, which he uses to seal Boo away, saving the world. Dragon Ball games are no stranger to what-if stories since they're way more interesting than playing through the same sagas over and over with prettier graphics in every game, but Supersonic Warriors has some of my favorite examples of it. Krillin's what-if story in particular is another good one, not just for the scenario, but because the events of it actually bleed over into his level 3 moveset for the game, granting him access to the same Kaioken to install as base Goku and the Spirit Bomb as his ultimate. Even cooler, if you complete a what-if story without losing once, depending on the character, you'll get a secret epilogue fight. Some of these are pretty funny, usually being either really humorous or wrapping up a loose end from the story mode itself. The game also allows for team fights as well, and you can use the L button to switch between characters. So it's kind of a tag game, I guess, but tagging has very little utility outside of switching characters and some repositioning stuff, so it's really only barely one. Outside of story mode though, the game also utilizes a ratio system of sorts, as well as using a system called Dragon Points, or DP, which would actually become a recurring thing in future arcs as Dragon Ball games. There is one neat thing involving the team aspect of the game though. If level 1 or 2 Gohan is the last person left on the team, he gets a rage boost that powers up his attacks, which is a pretty neat thing to include. Unlike Taiketsu, which was legitimately hard to look at sometimes, Supersonic Warriors has some top-notch sprite art thanks to the folks at ArcSys, the character portraits in particular being a standout. When a character does their ultimate move, you get a quick cut-in of the character that changes depending on what level they're at, and it's some of the most aesthetically pleasing Dragon Ball sprite work out there. Big fan of Majin Vegeta's in particular. Side note, but this game also has a gallery mode that showcases clean version of the ending art for every character, and those are also really cool to look at. This is hands down one of the most unique Dragon Ball fighting games out there, even today, and the fact that it planted the seeds for what would eventually morph into arguably the ultimate traditional Dragon Ball fighter is just the cherry on top of things. Also, this game has a phenomenal soundtrack, with themes being assigned to groups of characters instead of stage themes or singular character themes. Goku and Gohan share a pretty peaceful laid-back theme, Piccolo and Vegeta have a dramatic sounding theme befitting their past rivalries with Goku, and Gotenks, Fat Boo, and Ginyu all share a catchy but comedic sounding theme that fits their completely unserious nature. My personal favorite is the theme for Trunks and Krillin, which legitimately might be one of my personal favorite songs to come out of the Game Boy Advance hardware. It's the one that's being played for this section of the video. If you still have a Game Boy Advance or a DS Lite kicking around, or something available that can emulate the platform, I definitely recommend this game, even today. Outside of its direct sequel, no other Dragon Ball game out there really plays anything like it. Dragon Ball Z Supersonic Warriors 2 would release for the Nintendo DS in 2005, a little over a year after the first game's release. Like the first game, this was once again a joint Kavia and ArcSys project, though weirdly enough, a few key ArcSys staff members left not too long after this game's development and joined Sonic Team. Some of them still there today, and having worked on games as recent as Frontiers. I guess the Dragon Ball to Sonic pipeline really is a thing. Supersonic Warriors 2 leverages the jump in hardware to expand on almost everything the first game did mechanically. More characters, more supers, more modes, more content, pretty much all of the things that matter. Whereas I mentioned before that Supersonic Warriors is only really a tag game on the surface level, it's leaned into a bit more here, with the addition of tag team specials. Depending on your character composition and the amount of ki you have reserved, which can now go up to 200% by the way, you can use the touchscreen to initiate a combined team attack that deals a ton of damage. Some of these look pretty cool, and I've always loved how many unique ones there were. Speaking of, I should probably touch on the use of the bottom screen, pun totally intended. While the controls for the game are largely still using the traditional button scheme from the first game, the touchscreen is now used to tag out characters, done by tapping the respective character's portrait on the bottom screen. This is also used to call in characters via the new assist system. There's unlockable assist characters you can earn through the game's story and challenge modes, and tapping their portrait calls them in. This can range from Mr. Satan coming in with some bombs, or Yamcha stunning the opponent with a Wolf Fang fist. This specific implementation is going to show up again in another game a lot later in the video, so keep it in mind. Like with the first game, play modes outside of story mode utilize a ratio system, this time with specific characters being set to different DP values, somewhat akin to Capcom vs SNK 1. With the controls expanding by 2 extra buttons on DS, things get a little easier, with key blast and blocking now having their own buttons on A and B. X and Y are now heavy on light attack respectively, while L and R still largely have the same functions as the first game. Supers are now done by pressing X and A at the same time, and though the position of your character relative to your opponent still dictates what super you get like the first game, there's a few supers done here where you also want to be holding a specific direction while initiating it. While the supers themselves have lost the little portrait cut-ins on startup, they come out much faster now, making them a bit more reliable for whiff punishes. If you and your opponent do a super at the same time, unlike the first game, they'll now initiate a little beam struggle called super clashes here. Like in most other DBZ games, whoever mashes fastest wins. A lot of characters also now have unlockable installs done with the L button at a certain key threshold as well, which is nice. Only a few characters in the first game had such a thing, but here it's closer to being universal. This also allows some of the cast, particularly the Saiyans, to transform into Super Saiyans mid-fight as well, their key counting down as you use the form, though you can still charge it as usual. Pretty much all of the cast of the first game returns, though a good chunk of them have slightly redrawn sprites and updated animations. A lot of characters that only had Super Saiyan forms in the previous game now have playable base forms on top of that, like young Gohan and future Trunks. Honestly, the sprite work for the player characters and assists are arguably even better than in the first game. ArcSys really outdid themselves here. It should be noted though that the stages are largely polygonal now thanks to the DS hardware. I don't hate the look at all, but I've always personally been a fan of 2D sprites on 3D. The roster does see some new additions though. Cooler, Metacooler, and Broly. In an interesting twist, on top of Perfect Cell as usual, Semi-Perfect Cell is also playable. It's not often that you see Semi-Perfect Cell supersede Imperfect Cell, so it's kinda neat to see. Most of the game modes from the previous entry like Z-Battle, Training, Tutorial, and Story modes are back, though this game somewhat combines the general saga stories and the what-ifs from the previous game into one mode. This time around, you have individual character stories with branching paths. Following the main path more or less follows how the characters properly progress through the Dragon Ball plot, but the branching paths do their own thing and are more akin to the what-if scenarios in the previous game. Unlocking these scenarios can be tricky though, as they involve either winning a specific match via a timeout, ending a fight with a certain move, or using a specific character, and the game doesn't really hint about some of these conditions at all, so you may want to use a guide. While consolidating both story types into one mode is honestly probably the way to go about things, I do feel like the what-if scenarios aren't as creative as in the first game. They're not bad here at all, but I think something was a bit lost in the jump to the sequel. The story playthroughs are also how you'll be unlocking moves and transformations for your characters, so it's definitely in your best interest to play through everyone's story and fully complete the story paths to unlock everything. In that way, it's a bit similar to the first 3 Budokai games. It should be noted that the portrait art for the game is also completely redone, having a more muted color tone to it that seems to more deliberately evoke the color Toriyama covers for the manga volumes as opposed to the original art style in the first game. It's not bad, just different. One very small nitpick I have though is that the localization definitely seems a bit lacking compared to the first game, but that's just a minor gripe. While I think the first game has some stuff it does better, Supersonic Warriors 2, at least mechanically, blows away the original game. We'll be back on the DS in due time, but the mid-2000s also introduced a new competitor to Nintendo's handhelds, the Sony PlayStation Portable, and of course, Dragon Ball games would eventually make their way towards it. In this case, we'd actually see a previously console-only series get adapted for portables, with 2006's Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai. Shin Budokai, like the previous Budokai games, is developed by Dimps, the same company that would go on to co-develop Street Fighter 4 and 5, and pretty much handled most handheld Sonic platformers in the 2000s, among a ton of other things. Shin Budokai, both aesthetically and mechanically, builds off of the previous game in the series, fan favorite Budokai 3 for the PS2, featuring a roster that's a bit pared down from that game, but also featuring new characters that hadn't appeared in Budokai before. Unlike the first 3 games, which basically told abridged versions of the main Dragon Ball Z arcs, Shin Budokai's story is an adaptation of Movie 12, Fusion Reborn, which ends up dictating its roster a bit as well, including new characters to the Budokai games like Pikkon and Janemba. Funnily enough, the story mode here is handled somewhat similarly to Supersonic Warriors 2, as there's a main story path, but things can branch off depending on what actions you fulfill in fights, and they can lead to offshoot story paths, or even their own alternate, usually bad ending paths. The story starts off with a post-Buu Saga camping trip with Goku, and like in Fusion Reborn, the boundary between Earth and Hell ends up being breached and past villains begin appearing everywhere. Goku and Pikkon trace things back to Hell where they find Janemba, but things get complicated from there. It's for the most part pretty neat, though it's not doing anything too crazy. Well, okay, mostly. Gohan, fresh off of his defeat of Cell, is also playable in the game, and also a part of the story despite this being post-Buu, and the way his inclusion is justified is kinda out there. Basically, this whole business with Hell has somehow warped space and time, which is also how Future Trunks comes to be involved in the story. Okay, makes sense so far. However, in Gohan's case, it's a little more complicated than that. So, Gohan is physically in the future here, but not via time travel, so to speak. Instead, while asleep one night, a lonely Gohan, dearly missing his father after the event of the Cell games, dreams of being with his loved ones, and due to the space-time shenanigans, those dreams give him physical form during the events of this game's story. Alright, I'm not gonna lie, that's Kingdom Hearts as fuck, but I dig it. The gameplay for Shin Budokai is probably the most interesting thing about it though, as it retains a lot of Budokai 3's mechanics, but trims the fat a bit and crafts a faster-paced, surprisingly more execution-heavy game out of it. The spot dodge and teleport counter from Budokai 3 return, as well as being able to fly on command now by holding up during a backdash. While there's still set combo strings for each character, comboing into each character's special moves takes a bit more thought now. Transformations now have a dedicated input instead of just being punch, guard, and kick at the same time, now being done with down and the circle button. Similarly, ultimates also have a universal input as well, being done with up in the circle button. Ultimates are a lot less cinematic this time. They're still flashy, but they're a lot quicker and to the point this time around. The Shin Budokai games also retain the first 3 games' advanced mechanic of being able to cancel charged attacks with a guard to extend combo strings as well, though it's a lot easier said than done when playing on an actual PSP. Shin Budokai layers an all-new mechanic on top of things though, Aura. Aura is a state your character can be in for as long as you hold the R button and have ki available to spend. You can dash back and forth as well as around the opponent with Aura, or act defensively as well. Notably, you can perform an Aura Smash out of Aura Dash. This is a strong attack that staggers the opponent for a lengthy amount of time if you connect with it, allowing you to follow it up with just about anything you want. Practically speaking, it's the most reliable way to land an ultimate. This itself has its own advanced tech though, Aura Canceling. Instead of tapping the guard button when charging an attack for a cancel, you will want to very quickly tap the Aura button and then triangle to immediately cancel into the Aura Burst Smash, effectively giving you a way to combo into ultimates on top of enabling general combo extensions. Shin Budokai's visuals, despite being on hardware less capable than PS2, actually still manages to capture the aesthetics of Budokai 3 perfectly, which in my opinion was the best looking Dragon Ball Z fighter at the time. I can't emphasize enough just how much of a leap forward that game was over the first 2. Despite being a handheld spin-off of the Budokai games, both this and the next game actually ended up kind of dictating the mechanics of the Budokai series when it returned to consoles, Burst Limit and Infinite World particularly having mechanics taken directly from these games. This would be followed up in 2007 with a direct sequel, Shin Budokai Another Road, or simply Shin Budokai 2 in some territories. Unlike the first game, this one tells a wholly original story, though the scenario is one that Dragon Ball Super years later would eventually canonically touch on in its own way. This one imagines what would happen if Babidi managed to resurrect Majin Buu in Future Trunks' timeline. This game retains the branching path system from the first Shin Budokai for its story mode, but those sections themselves are bridged with a new real-time tower defense game where enemies attack cities, and you have to assemble a team of fighters across a 3D rendered world map to stop them. I'm not really much of a tower defense guy, so these sections always dragged for me, but I appreciate Dims trying something a little different for once. The roster from the previous game is retained, giving some characters new transformations that they didn't have before, like Metacooler and Super Saiyan 4 for Goku, on top of several new characters, some of which returned from Budokai 2 and 3, like Bardock and Tabura. The most interesting new addition to the roster by far, however, is Future Gohan. To my knowledge, this is the only Dims Budokai game that he's ever been playable in, which is pretty funny to think about. His moveset is also pretty inspired. He still uses stuff like the Masenko, but he also utilizes Trunks' burning attack, and in a really cool bit of accidental foreshadowing, his ultimate in base form is the Special Beam Cannon. There's also a new addition to how aura works as well, Aura Burst Charge. By pressing L and R simultaneously, your character will get a power up, and what that power up does is dependent on the character. Some get a damage buff, some get their ki charged faster, and some characters like Boo use their regeneration to earn back health. The game on the whole is largely more Shin Budokai, and that's a good thing. This was one of the first PSP games I personally bought on my own back in the late 2000s, so I have a lot of fond memories of playing this in high school. The game itself is, along with Budokai 3 and Infinite World, one of the more beloved titles among hardcore fans that make up the scene for it. It's probably the fastest and most demanding from an execution standpoint of the games at a high level, so I can see the appeal. There's one more Budokai-styled game on the platform to talk about, but that's where things start getting weird. Your first reaction to learning that Dragonball Evolution has a video game adaptation is probably to think that it's hot garbage, which isn't a completely unreasonable assumption given the source material it's working with. But I'm here to tell you that Evolution isn't only not trash, it's actually kinda decent. But there's a pretty obvious reason why. It's, again, a DIMS developed game, and though it's based on Dragonball Evolution, everything else in the game, from the menu UI, to the engine, to the controls and movesets, and even the animations, are reused from the Shin Budokai games. Dragonball Evolution dropped in 2009 as a PSP exclusive, and though that seems weird, it does make sense. I don't think anyone involved was expecting a significant return on investment with this game, so developing for a then current lower budget handheld system and reusing as much as possible from a previous game makes sense. I do find it a little weird that there was never a PS2 port of this though, especially since PS2's 2009 lineup was similarly filled with a bunch of no-frills direct Wii and PSP ports. Guess that just goes to show you where everyone's head was at with this. All that said, this game, on top of actually playing decently, is also a pretty okay package all things considered. There's of course a story mode which covers the events of the movie as you'd expect, but there's also an arcade mode that has its own little story progression scene separate from the story mode for each character, which is actually pretty neat. Even Shin Budokai didn't really do this for their equivalent mode to that extent. There's even a mission mode that asks you to grasp everything from the game's basic mechanics to more advanced stuff. There's even missions centered around those cancel combos I talked about earlier. As for the roster itself, it's a lot smaller than the Shin Budokai games, fixating solely on characters from the movie. Though if you played the previous Budokai games, you will recognize a lot of the animations and movesets. Goku pretty much plays like he does in the previous Shin Budokai games, much with the same strings carrying over. He is, this time, voiced by Yuri Lowenthal though, which caught me off guard a bit. A lot of the other characters have pretty familiar moves as well. For example, Fulum, hilarious walk cycle aside, largely reuses Janemba's moveset and animations from the previous game. Renpa Gohan's staff moves are taken from future Trunks' sword normals. And Piccolo, predictably, has some of his old strings and specials, though he notably is lacking any of the normals he has from Budokai 3 onward that involved stretching his limbs. Goku even has his Uzaru form from the movie playable, which I think is hilarious, but doubly so since he's basically a reskinned Broly, from the walk cycle, his normals, and even having Broly's gigantic press special move. While spot dodging, teleport counters, and pursuit attacks are still present, one key ability has been removed: flying. Though the characters can dash around the stage as always and can even still use the aura mechanics from the previous Shin Budokai games, characters can't actually take to the sky at all. This leads to a more grounded game, literally. The Budokai series is one of those games where strings can have different properties when done in the air, so this gives you a little less to worry about in terms of combo routing, though that can also make things less interesting to actually play for some people. There's admittedly a few characters that get a little more experimental though. Bulma, Chi-Chi, and Mai all have a handful of normals sourced from Android 18 and Videl in previous games, but actually end up having pretty interesting playstyles overall. Bulma, for example, utilizes a gun fu kind of moveset. Chi-Chi is a straight hand-to-hand brawler with more than a few similarities to Videl in previous games, whereas Mai uses a mix of hand-to-hand with a bunch of gadgets she can use at both close and far range. Another interesting note lies with ultimates. They're a lot easier to combo into now, and where you would have needed an aura charge cancel to reliably combo into them before, ultimates can now be cancelled into from certain normals, which is kinda wild in comparison. There's also notably a gallery feature, and honestly, it's one of the better ones I've seen for a game at this point in time, especially for a movie tie-in. Sure, the gallery features concept art and designs for the movie, which is cool even if I don't care for a lot of the designs, but it also comes with pretty decent quality, at least for 2009, pictures of all of the sets used for the movie as well. The most interesting part to me is the storyboard, which lays out a lot of the movie's key scenes in a detailed storyboard fashion. I was only expecting a handful of storyboard panels, but no, pretty much the entire movie is chronicled via several pages worth of storyboards, and it's kind of a cool inclusion, even considering my distaste of the movie itself. Don't get me wrong, Dragonball Evolution is a bad movie, and I wouldn't even recommend watching it as a joke. As a tie-in movie game, however, it's surprisingly decent though. Is there any reason to play it over Shin Budokai Another Road or even the first Shin Budokai game? No, not really. But if you, for whatever reason, want to experience the story of Dragon Ball Evolution in a less painful manner than the movie, the PSP game is the way to go, I guess. If nothing else, the juxtaposition of seeing those Budokai animations on these movie-inspired character models is worth its weight in laughs alone. The last Dragon Ball fighter on PSP shifts to another beloved DBZ fighting game subseries, the Tenkaichi games. Now, I'll be honest, I was always more of a Budokai head than the Tenkaichi one, but I've still had my fun with the series, and Tenkaichi Tag Team on the PSP was one such game. Like Dims with the Shin Budokai games, the developer behind the previous console entries, Spike, about 2 years out from merging with Chunsoft, took point in development here, and like those games, the end result is a game that feels at home on the platform without sacrificing too much of the series' identity. Probably due in part to UMD space, Tenkaichi Tag has a pared down roster, coming to about around 70 characters when you include transformations, but the cast is fully rooted in Z, so nothing from GT or earlier in the series this time around. As the name suggests, Tenkaichi Tag's main draw is its 2v2 fight setup, allowing for real-time 2v2 fights. The Tenkaichi games had featured fights with multiple characters before, but it always involved said characters leaving the fight entirely to swap in. That said, the title is a bit misleading, as you can't actually switch between the characters on your team on the fly, but you can set how they act in battle, if you want them to always target your current opponent, or if you want them doing their own thing. I will say, even though this game does the usual start with Raditz and with Boo's story retelling most Dragon Ball fighting games of this time went for, it's kind of interesting how the 2v2 system contextualizes certain fights. Hell, it probably has one of the most interesting takes on the Raditz fight in the Dragon Ball game, because for once, you're fighting on a true tag team with Piccolo, just like in the source material. Whereas the cinematic nature of a lot of the specials were toned down in the Shin Budokai games to emphasize its bigger focus on lightning-fast combat, Tenkaichi Tag does not compromise on them at all, and the result is pretty impressive actually. Personally, I think Tenkaichi Tag Team's art style as a whole is pretty pleasant. The Shin Budokai games look great as well, don't get me wrong, but there's just something about the way Tenkaichi Tag's art style comes together that just sits well with me. I don't know. Like with Shin Budokai and its respective console entries, the controls for Tenkaichi Tag should be pretty familiar, though it does take some keys from Raging Blast. Ascending and descending may feel a bit finicky on the default control scheme though. For that reason, I'd actually personally recommend the Type B control scheme in the options menu, as that makes mobility a bit more intuitive, at least when played on the PSP proper. The story mode this time around is Dragon Walker. It's a fairly standard retelling of the main Dragon Ball Z sagas, but does so using a small world map with chibi versions of the characters you control. It's not especially involved, but as an RPG guy that loves me a good world map, I do have a soft spot for it. You don't always have to beeline straight for story fights though. You can talk to other characters on the map to spar with them, and even undertake some quests by talking to NPCs. It's not necessarily complex or anything, but it's a neat little distraction. It reminds me of a very scaled down version of Dragon Universe from Budokai 3. Thankfully, Tenkaichi Tag takes more after 2 and 3 than the first game mechanically, so you can transform mid-fight with the select button instead of only being locked into one form like in Tenkaichi 1, which is great. The voice clips for the characters are kinda low quality and muffled, but I think that's just a consequence of all the characters being voiced and having to fit on PSP UMDs that max out at just under 2 GB of capacity.
Super Saiyan!
What? You can turn into a Super Saiyan?
Not going to let Kakarot show me up!
Again, even as more of a Budokai guy myself, something about Tenkaichi Tag just clicks with me. I don't know if it's its portable nature or what, but this and Tenkaichi 2 are the games in the series I still go back to on occasion. Tenkaichi Tag is also notably one of 2 games in this video that had a downloadable demo around release, so I have some fond memories of playing that a lot back then as well. If you still have a PSP kicking around and enjoy the Tenkaichi games, I think this is a solid title to have. That being said, because this was a later PSP game, this didn't get an especially large print run outside of Japan, so US and Power Region copies can get a bit pricey if you absolutely need a physical version. The following year would see the series hop back to the Nintendo DS of all things to get another Dragon Ball fighting game, and perhaps the most unique one on this list for a multitude of reasons. Dragon Ball Kai Ultimate Butoden would release for the DS in Japan in February of 2011, and is notably one of a rare few Dragon Ball games using the Kai moniker in lieu of Z, based on the then currently airing remaster of Dragon Ball Z, trim to cut filler and have pacing more akin to the manga. As the name suggests, the game is also a revival of the Butoden series, which goes way back to the Super Famicom, the last related entry prior to this being the maligned Final Bout on PS1. Ultimate Butoden was developed at Bandai Namco in collaboration with Game Republic, who was no stranger to the DS and Dragon Ball. They were also the developers of the Dragon Ball Origins games, action RPGs covering the earliest parts of Dragon Ball on the Nintendo DS. This also informs the game's art style as well, which is more or less the same as in Origins, and considering how good Origins looks on the hardware, I'd say this is actually a pretty good call. Ultimate Butoden boasts a pretty big character roster considering the platform it's on, and notably also features the first playable appearance of King Kai in a Dragon Ball fighter, which is pretty cool. Though the game bears the Butoden name, it thankfully plays better than any one game in that series, Y and X being light and heavy attack, B being a dodge and counter button, and A being for throws. Key blasts use the R button, and you have a burst that can be done by hitting all 4 face buttons. That dodge button in particular you'll be using a lot, as you can dodge certain types of melee hits with it. That'll sometimes put you into a little back and forth dodging sequence with your opponent, which is pretty cool. There is also no traditional block button. You can block by standing completely still, but otherwise you'll be using the dodge button more often on defense. This game probably has the most unique key mechanics of any game in this video, in that it's tied to a bar in the bottom of the screen. The more filled up the bar is, the more attacks you have access to, but if it drops too low, you lose access to your special moves. There's power levels denoted by arrows in the bottom corners of the top screen. By pressing L in either up or down, you can power up or down. The higher your power level, the stronger your attacks become. The key bar refills over time, but the higher your power level, the slower it regenerates. Like in Supersonic Warriors 1 though, this doesn't apply to the androids, who have infinite ki, as they do in the source material, which is a neat touch. Ultimate Butoden's main calling card, however, comes in its supers, which honestly might be even more impressive looking than the PSP games we've covered, which is doubly impressive considering the gap in power between the 2 platforms. That said, the supers themselves are interactive minigames of a sort. This ranges from quickly pressing the displayed buttons or timing buttons when aligned with an on-screen reticule. This isn't for everybody, I suppose, and it vaguely reminds me of some of the similar little minigames for attacks in Budokai 2 and 3 specifically, but I don't mind it as much here. As per usual, there's a story mode that goes from the Saiyan Saga all the way to the final fight with Kid Buu, though it should be noted that Kai hadn't actually gotten to the Buu Saga at the time of this game's release. The story mode features cutscenes more or less done in the style of Dragon Ball Origins story scenes, which is pretty great, though only a handful of them are voiced. That makes sense here considering DS cartridge space sizes. Some sequences are QTEs which require you to match the input on the screen. The fail states for these can be pretty fun to see play out though. Like a few of the games we've talked about before, this game also features what-if scenarios too, but this time around, they lean way more into the humorous side of things and are more extended gags than anything. There's a set of what-ifs in particular that takes all of the scenarios in the series where Goku swoops in to save the day and replaces him with Yamcha, which usually ends up with him getting his ass kicked brutally. It's a pretty good bit. Broly is also a playable character in this game, and I'm only pointing it out here because of the way you have to unlock him. You unlock him with a button code: up, X, down, B, L, Y, R, and A on the game's title screen. You'll hear a sound clip of his voice and he'll be unlocked. What's particularly notable about this is that it's a throwback code of sorts. It's the same exact code used to unlock Broly and Goku as playable characters in Super Butoden 2 on the Super Famicom, right down to a Broly sound clip confirming the correct code entry. Little throwbacks like that are neat and really kinda sell this game as a new Butoden entry. There's also a ton of unlockable alternate costumes in the game as well. Stuff like battle damaged outfits or even casual wear. Frieza, who technically only has his final form and his cyborg form playable, gets his first form as an alternate costume, which is a pretty good compromise. There's also a Tekken-esque customization system, where you can equip accessories onto your character that's actually visible on your character during a fight. Of course, the biggest issue of this game is that it never got a release outside of Japan. It's not a game that requires too much Japanese knowledge. The most issues you might have might be navigating menus, but it is unfortunate. As of this video's publication, there's an English patch that translates the menus and a good chunk of the story mode that's publicly available, which is what's being used in the video. If you have a DS or 3DS, I definitely recommend giving this one a spin. DS doesn't have too many traditional fighting games, but this is probably one of the best. The final handheld exclusive Dragon Ball fighting game would release 4 years later for the Nintendo 3DS, and is also the final game in the Butoden series as well, 2015's Extreme Butoden. Extreme Butoden is probably best known for, once again, being developed by Arc System Works, and being the impetus behind the eventual development of Dragon Ball FighterZ a few years later. Considering FighterZ borrows more than people realize from Extreme Butoden, I think it's fair to call Extreme Butoden the Children of the Atom to FighterZ Marvel vs. Capcom. Though the game bears the Butoden name and leans into some of the legacy of that series as well, even more so than the previous game, the game itself is also kind of a stealth sequel to the previous Arc-Sys Dragon Ball fighter, Supersonic Warriors 2. Extreme Butoden utilizes the Dragon Points or DP system from Supersonic Warriors 2, different characters having different DP values. Like Supersonic Warriors 2, there's also assists, each with their own DP values as well. There's way more assists in Extreme Butoden compared to Supersonic Warriors 2 though, so much so that I'd actually say the assists are the game's primary gimmick. I think I'd say these assists feel most similar to the partner assist calls in Marvel vs. Capcom 1, or for a more recent example, the cameos in Mortal Kombat 1. These assists range from buffs to your character, debuffs to your opponent, or just straight up screen filling attacks. A lot of the more effective assists can also function as combo starters and extenders, so there's a ton of utility between them all. Shout out to the Chi-Chi assist, where she gets mad and fills the screen with a rapidly expanding, screen-obscuring manga text bubble. There's a ton of assists in the game though, and some were even added to the game as free DLC after the game's launch. We'll talk about the game's post-launch support in a bit more detail later. That said, the assist calls, like in Supersonic Warriors 2, can only be done via touchscreen. This makes assist calls a bit tricky to do in an actual 3DS, especially since you have to be in a neutral state to call them in the first place. Unlike a lot of the last few games, Extreme Butoden is like Supersonic Warriors before it, a sprite-based game with 3D rendered stages. The sprite art for this game looks incredible, and honestly, kind of worth the price of admission alone. It also looks pretty good in the 3DS screen itself as well, but I'm personally one of those weirdos that unironically love the 3D effect of the 3DS, so your mileage may vary there. Extreme Butoden has a pretty simple combat system overall, but that doesn't mean there isn't some depth to it. You have light and heavy attacks, an evade button, and a special attack button. Light and heavy are self-explanatory, while evade does a little forward dash maneuver that can cross up the opponent if done directly in front of them. If you press evade right as a normal is about to hit you though, you'll perform a perfect dodge, which teleports the character directly behind the opponent. The special attack button differs for every character, and also depends on whether or not the character is in the air or on the ground. For example, Base Goku's standard special is a standard ki blast, but if done in the air, he does a backwards throw that can be followed up with if you're close enough to the ground. One interesting note about the specials in this game is that a lot of them would end up also being implemented in a lot of the cast Dragon Ball FighterZ movesets. I know, no shit characters are gonna have their iconic moves from game to game, but some of Extreme Butoden's specific moves are almost a one-to-one transition. Krillin's jumping special in Extreme Butoden is his 2S in FighterZ. Both Adult and Kid Gohan's machine gun kicks function exactly the same between Extreme Butoden and FighterZ. And Android 18's Jumping S is nearly identical to her Jumping S in Extreme Butoden. Speaking of, that Jump S in Extreme Butoden was actually part of an infinite she can perform in that game. Pressing L and Y initiates each character's surprise attack, which is more or less this game's term for universal overhead. LNX initiates a character's blitz attack, which is a special technique that uses up ki and is different for each character. Base Goku, for example, gets a Kaioken charge tackle for his, while Super Saiyan Goku gets instant transmission instead. LNA is Burst Strike. Like Blitz Attack, these are generally unique per character and are usually either a beam attack or a melee move with special properties. Vegeta's, for example, is Big Bang Attack. When your character or team is under 50% health, you'll go into Awakening mode, denoted by your key bar getting electrical sparks. In this state, a few new things apply. For one, you can charge a ki up to 200% for your character's strongest ultimate, denoted by an animated cut-in. Pressing L and B in this mode in the neutral state activates Dragon Saw. This powered up state vastly increases your damage output, but your health ticks down to 1% while it's activated. L and B in Awakening mode, and specifically while you're in hit stun, initiates a one-time burst called Sparking that knocks the opponent away. Not to be confused with the fighter's mechanic of the same name, mind you. Extreme Butoden has its fair share of single-player modes, though some were admittedly free DLC. First is Z Story, which starts off as yet another Dragon Ball Z retelling, starting at Raditz and ending with Boo. Beating that initial story unlocks several what-if character stories, though they're nowhere near as good as the ones we've talked about previously. Beating the first Z story also unlocks Adventure Mode, which has you shooting for missions during fights, like beating an opponent within a certain time limit. Getting good ranks on these can also unlock different assists, making them pretty worthwhile. This setup itself also makes explicitly clear that it's an alternate universe unto itself, and you start seeing that pretty early in, with the plot being kicked off by Omega Shenron, and the references to the events of GT being casually mentioned, even though characters like Kami are still around. It's weird. Beating that unlocks Extreme World Tournament, which I'd say is probably the closest this game gets to an arcade mode, going up against a ladder of themed opponents, though sometimes other characters will jump in and challenge you between matches. Clearing all of the Z stories unlocks Broly as a playable character, beating Adventure Mode unlocks Super Saiyan God Goku, and beating Extreme World Tournament unlocks Beerus. There's one last secret character, Super Saiyan Blue Goku. In Japan, you unlock them by having save data of the demo on your 3DS when booting the full game. Outside of Japan, though US and PAL territories did get the demo, we simply just had to enter a code at the title screen instead. So far, pretty okay set of features. So, how was the online at launch, you might ask? Well, it didn't exist. Yeah, for whatever reason, Extreme Butoden, despite releasing on a platform with multiple fully featured fighting games with functioning online, including one that was literally there day one, had no online multiplayer of any sort when it released. Even crazier, there wasn't even a training mode at all either. Missing out on online is one thing, but no training mode? In a 2015 fighting game? Just what? The outcry surrounding the omission of these features was surprisingly loud, especially in Japan where the game launched first. For a while, there was actually some uncertainty as to whether or not Bamco would even have this localized. The game would be released worldwide in the end, and it'd also be announced that the game would receive a downloadable update that would patch in online and training mode, on top of adding more assists, which is pretty nice. That said, the Japanese version of the game actually ended up getting more content overall, going up to patch 1.5, whereas the Western release's 1.1 patch is just about equivalent to the Japanese 1.4 update. I mentioned that Super Saiyan Blue Goku could be unlocked via button code, and that was also true of the new downloadable assists as well. They've thankfully been chronicled online, but there's a lot of them, and you might be on the title screen entering those codes in for a while. And there's some crazy shit in some of those DLC assists. I'm talking like Super Saiyan 4 Gohan crazy. Honestly, this game's assists are kind of unhinged in the best way possible, like Krillin on his police scooter forcing characters into a single direction, or Goku with his big ass tractor from Super. The Japanese release also got a new stage, the Universe 6 Arena, which sadly never made it to the international versions of the game. One quality of life change that's easy to forget in all of this was speeding up ultimate moves. For whatever reason, in the initial Japanese release of the game, ultimate attacks were way slower than they'd eventually become, and it really dragged down fights. After the game's first patch in Japan, they were massively sped up, and I believe the English release had them sped up by default in the game's 1.0 launch state. Probably the best known aspect of the game that's also exclusive to the Japanese release is its course compatibility with One Piece Great Pirate Coliseum. This was a One Piece fighter by ArcSys using the exact same engine and art style as Extreme Butoden, and also on the 3DS. Both games were patched to allow players of one game to fight people playing the other, either locally or online. Even though I owned the Japanese 3DS and the Japanese version of Extreme Butoden at the time, I only ever dabbled with this mode a few times, but poor netcode aside, it was actually pretty cool. Gaio Winquote has a fantastic video diving into the specifics of this collaboration if you want to learn more. And if you'd like to see high-level match footage of this, I highly recommend checking out Griffybone's channel for some pretty good lengthy sets. Also, the music for this game is outstanding. Supreme Kai's world, and Destroy Namek in particular, are some of the best themes ever composed for a Dragon Ball game. Little fun fact as well, the theme for King Kai's planet in Extreme Butoden is actually a remix of the Supreme Kai world stage theme in Supersonic Warriors too. All in all, though it took some patches to get there, I think Extreme Butoden ended up in a pretty good state overall. It's still a pretty fun game to mess around with, though you pretty much have to resort to emulation to play the game online these days. As we all know, Extreme Butoden ended up more or less being the dry run for fighters, and the rest is history. I suppose ArcSys being associated with Dragon Ball Z and Supersonic Warriors makes the Switch port something of a full circle moment, I guess. With dedicated portables not really being a thing anymore, hybrid consoles and portable PCs being the new wave, we'll likely never see a run of games like this again, but it doesn't mean we can't look back at what we have and how we got here, right? That's gonna do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to the patrons that support the channel. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.